I think we have arrived at Square Enix's last-ditch effort to try and right the ship, to try and turn things around. So, this is kind of funny to me, because after the last video I uploaded on the topic of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth basically flopping, there were a number of people that clicked that video, fanboys, shills, idiots, who tried to argue that, oh, the game didn't fail, it didn't flop. Well, recent news would suggest otherwise. Not that we didn't already have a strong indication before. Square Enix has finally admitted that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth didn't meet sales expectations. And not only did it not meet sales expectations, but the company's stock has plummeted by nearly 16%. And while this article mentions that the game impressed critics and players alike, clearly the people that it impressed were among the minority that thought the first game was a masterpiece. And it was anything but. In this game, judging from the demo that I played, is even worse. So clearly, the majority did not buy Rebirth, and it has resulted in the disaster that we have been seeing since the game's release back in late February. Square Enix's operating income of 32.5 billion yen now represents a 26.6 year-on-year decrease from last year, and their overall operating income of 40 million yen has fell short of the 57 million yen average, according to industry analysts. So now the question is, what is Square Enix to do? Well, they've announced a new strategy, as I mentioned in the beginning. And that strategy is they're pursuing a multi-platform strategy and they're ditching PlayStation exclusivity. Now, the question remains, is this actually going to help Square Enix? Is this actually going to help the Final Fantasy IP, the franchise as a whole? Is this going to help, any of their upcoming games that are on the slate? Well, unfortunately, I must once again be the bearer of bad news. The answer to this question is no. It's not going to help. And now I'm going to explain why. So right here, I have a list of Square Enix video games. Everything the company has ever released, I'm assuming since the merger, which was back in 2003. So let's go to some of their more recent games released over the last few years. Starting with Final Fantasy VII Remake, so that's around, 2020. If you look at most of their releases, most of their games have already been multi-platform out of the gate. And it has not helped them. It hasn't helped their bottom line. Let's take a look at some examples. Babylon's Fall, one of their biggest failures over the last 5 or so years. Babylon's Fall, when it came out, it released on Windows, it released on PlayStation 4, which at the time was the most popular home console available on the market, and it released on PlayStation 5. The game failed, it died within less than a year, and they stopped printing copies. Let's take a look at Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin, one of the biggest pieces of shit that I've played from this particular series. This game was released on all available platforms, with the exception of Nintendo. No one bought this game. This game was purchased by a very niche audience, and not only that, but Stranger of Paradise, they tried to chase after the Souls-like audience. And as populated as that audience is, they didn't take to, purchasing a Final Fantasy game that copies the Souls-like formula. And OG fans, such as myself, OG players, who prefer anything but a Souls-like for this particular series, was turned off. Only a very small minute of players actually liked this game. That didn't work out. We have other games like Valkyrie Elysium that no one bought, that was released on multiple platforms. We have Star Ocean: The Divine Force, which was also released on multiple platforms, including Steam via Windows, via PC. No one bought that shit. We have Crisis Core Reunion, which was released on multiple platforms. No one cared, except for the people that played the PSP original. We have Forspoken, which, yes, this game was a PlayStation 5 exclusive, but it also released on PC via Steam day one. And this game is also one of the biggest failures, one of the biggest flops that Square Enix has released over the last few years. No one cared. No one bought the game. So here's the thing. There's really only been 3 games that Square Enix has agreed to a PlayStation exclusivity deal. That's Final Fantasy VII Remake, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and Final Fantasy XVI. People have been blaming the underperformance, the flop of Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. They've been blaming these games underselling, underperforming, on the fact that they're only exclusive to the PlayStation 5. Releasing these games on PlayStation 4 and or PC day one would not have saved them. And the reason being is because the IP just is not popular anymore. The people that play Final Fantasy, that really enjoyed the franchise, most of those people have been alienated. And the reason they've been alienated is because Square Enix has been chasing an audience that doesn't represent nor appreciate the older games of the franchise. They've been trying to make these games, the newer entries, they've been trying to make these games as big as possible, as bombastic as possible. They've taken them in a very generic action-oriented direction. Final Fantasy XVI in particular, using that as an example. This is literally just a ripoff of Devil May Cry, and it doesn't do Devil May Cry better than Devil May Cry does Devil May Cry. It doesn't beat that franchise at its own game. And even with Final Fantasy VII, the remake trilogy, the biggest problem with these newer Final Fantasy VII games is that they took what was supposed to be and what people thought it was going to be, and when I say people, I'm talking about the OG fans, such as myself. They took what was supposed to be a single release, and they deliberately chopped the game up into 3 different parts, so they can monetize the game over time through multiple entries. And then, not only did they do that, they changed the story that no one asked them to change. They changed the combat system that no one asked them to change. And then they overspent on the project with a ridiculous budget that the game realistically could not make back. And we are seeing the results of that. One of the reasons that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has not sold as great as Final Fantasy VII Remake is because it's a sequel. And historically, sequels don't sell as well as their predecessors. And there's multiple reasons for that. People don't want to keep buying the same thing over and over again. And then the title of these games is also sending mixed messages to people who don't keep up with this stuff. You have Final Fantasy VII Remake, and then you have Rebirth. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that don't know that Rebirth is actually a sequel to Remake. And for the people that do know that, they weren't interested in paying $70 for Part 2, and then you gotta wait years and years away to get Part 3. Splitting this project up into 3 different games, I think, was the biggest mistake that they made, because it should have just been one game, along with all of the other issues that these games have. So, going back to my initial point, let's say Square Enix released Final Fantasy XVI on all platforms when it came out. Let's say they released Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on all platforms when it came out. The games would have sold a bit more than what they did initially, but it would not have saved them. In particular, let's look at the Xbox platform, Xbox Series S and Xbox Series X. Most of the people that are on Xbox do not play JRPGs. They are not interested in JRPGs, historically speaking. There have been Final Fantasy games released on the Xbox platforms. it did not help them sell 10 million copies for everyone that was released on those platforms. The same goes with PC. PC is the biggest gaming platform. There's 1.7 billion PC gamers. The number is expected to increase to 1.8 billion as of last year or this year. There's 3 billion people worldwide that are gamers. Nearly half of all those people, 48%, are gaming on PC. PC is the biggest gaming platform. Most of these people don't give a shit about Final Fantasy or anything else from Square Enix. And I'm just speaking facts. Just being realistic. Most people don't give a shit about Square Enix and their franchises. So releasing these games on PC, maybe they would have sold perhaps 1 million to 2 million units more than the initial sales figures. But it still would not have helped them reach 10 million units sold, lifetime units. And to back up what I'm saying, you only need to look at Final Fantasy VII Remake, which eventually was released on Windows, on PC. The game as of last year hasn't even sold 8 million units, 2 years after it was released on PC for the first time. And once again, since Rebirth is a sequel, it's not going to sell as well as Remake when it eventually comes to PC. Square Enix currently right now is working on the PC version of Final Fantasy XVI. It's not going to sell that many copies when they finally release it. And if they try and pull the same bullshit that they did with Final Fantasy VII Remake, and they release the game exclusively on the Epic Games Store first, and Steam second months later, and then charge $70 full price for it, it's definitely not going to sell at that point. Most people are going to wait for a sale. So, considering that Square Enix, with most of their games over the last few years, are actually multi-platform games, and they only have about three games that are PlayStation exclusives, at least from the Final Fantasy series, I don't see how a new, so-called new, quote-unquote, multi-platform strategy is really going to help them. That's not going to help Final Fantasy. That's not going to help Square Enix with their problem. And I think they're actually making the problem worse by canceling a bunch of games that they haven't announced. They're expected to lose 22.1 billion yen because of all of these games that they've been canceling behind closed doors. And 22.1 billion yen translates to over $140 million. And that's with the fiscal year ending in March of this year. Now, they have a new CEO. He's trying to right the ship, but honestly, I think it's about too late. I'm going to repeat what I said in the last video that I made on Square Enix. The only way possible that they can fix the problem that they have with Final Fantasy and with the company as a whole, I think two things need to happen. For Final Fantasy in particular, which is what's going to help them in general. Because I think if you fix Final Fantasy, then, you fix Square Enix, because that's their flagship franchise. So, two things need to happen. They need to take power away, or just get rid of these people entirely, the directors and the producers of some of these recent Final Fantasy games. And they need to give that power that those people had to someone else, someone new, someone unproven. In particular, Tetsuya Nomura, Motomu Toriyama, Hamaguchi, Nojima, Naoki Yoshida, Takai, Meihiro. Get rid of all of them. Clean house. It makes no sense to keep the people in power that's delivered Square Enix 2 major flops in a row. It makes no sense. As long as these people are in charge, as long as these people have power at the company, the problem is not going to be fixed just because they switch to a multi-platform strategy. It's not going to work. So that's number one. Number two, and this is going to be a more controversial, subjective opinion, but it's the right opinion, which is why I'm going to discuss it. The second thing they need to do with Final Fantasy, and I've been saying this for years. I've been doing narration since 2018 on YouTube, and I've been saying it since close to the very beginning, since I started doing narration. The problem with Final Fantasy is that the series is inconsistent. There's no consistency to it because they change all sorts of shit with each game, and the messaging of the franchise is fucked up as well. And what that does is it scares away new consumers, and because the series is inconsistent, it also alienates OG players, and it's resulted in the newer entries flopping. The major exception was Final Fantasy 15. And Final Fantasy 15, the reason Final Fantasy 15 went on to become successful, I mean, there's multiple reasons, but I think the major thing with Final Fantasy 15 and why that game ultimately went on to sell 10 million units is because they made it relatable. They made it relatable to people who don't like Final Fantasy, who would never, under any circumstances, buy a Final Fantasy game. They made it relatable for those people. You know, the game was set in a modern day setting. There were things in that game that people could actually relate to, unlike a lot of the other entries. The real-time combat system also did help, but they just made a game that people could actually connect to. And I've worked with some of these people on older jobs who admitted that they actually were interested in 15. People who would never buy a Final Fantasy game. But that was 15. That was one game. You're not going to fix the problem with the franchise with one game. What Square Enix needs to do, they need to reboot Final Fantasy. Reboot it entirely. Make the next game, don't call it Final Fantasy 17. Just call it Final Fantasy. Start over. Stop trying to sell these games through nostalgia. Putting in all of these classic monsters and, putting all these classic characters and, putting all these female characters in skimpy outfits and shit. It's not going to help this franchise sell. It's not going to work. By rebooting the franchise, by starting over, you're giving the franchise a chance to reintroduce itself and establish a new audience. Now, they've tried doing that without rebooting the franchise. They tried it with Final Fantasy 15, it did not work. They tried it with Final Fantasy 16, it did not work. In a way, they've tried it with the Final Fantasy 7 Remake Trilogy, and it is not working. These games are not selling. They are underperforming, they are flopping. People do not give a shit outside of the core minority, hardcore shill audience. No one gives a shit. And it's gotten to the point where even the people who follow the franchise, who've been longtime players of the series, such as myself, we are losing interest. I did not buy Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and I have no intentions on paying for it until I find a used copy, probably for around $40. I represent the majority. The majority did not buy the game. The game did not meet expectations internally. It didn't meet initial sales projections, let alone long-term sales projections. Their stock tumbled by 16%. Making these games multi-platform when people don't care is not going to help them. What Square Enix is going to have to do, and I hate to say this, because I really don't like this fucking game at all, but what they're going to have to do, they're going to have to pull a God of War 2018. That is the only way they're going to save the Final Fantasy franchise. Now, if you look at God of War 2018, there's a few things to note about this game and why it ultimately became successful. God of War 2018 drew inspiration primarily from two sources. The first is The Last of Us. The game introduced this parent-child relationships very similar to The Last of Us, for its storytelling. And then it also copied a lot from the Souls-like genre with its combat system. but it did its own thing with it, and it worked for the majority of people that played the game. And what this game accomplished is that it drew in an audience that never cared about the God of War games in the past. It drew in a huge audience that never liked God of War, never cared about it. Now, I'd argue that's actually the issue with it, but from a business perspective, they delivered. The game was a major success. Now, God of War is a soft reboot, but it's a reboot nonetheless. You can't really do a soft reboot with Final Fantasy because each game tells a different story. I'd argue what they need to do is not just reboot the series, but instead of changing things up, with each game, they need to craft a game that tells a story that's personal between probably no more than two different characters, and then continue that story for multiple installments. So there's some consistency. You eliminate confusion by doing it that way. You eliminate confusion from new players. You eliminate questions like, okay, so this is Final Fantasy 17. Do I have to play the previous 16 installments to understand what's going on in this game? You eliminate questions like that. This is what a reboot would bring to the franchise. It would fix all of these problems. But let's be realistic. Is Square Enix actually going to do anything that I'm talking about? Well, the simple answer is no, they're not. Because Square Enix is ran by idiots. People who do not listen to the fans, people who don't understand common sense, people who just want to do whatever they want to do, and just make random decisions that ultimately end up hurting both the franchise and the company at large. And this is how they've gotten to this place where they're at. They think that, okay, we'll just put our games on Xbox day one, or we'll put our games on PC day one, and that's going to fix the problem. No, that's not going to fix the problem. Xbox players don't give a fuck about Final Fantasy. PC players don't give a fuck about Final Fantasy. You have to make them care. The franchise needs to be rebooted. Whether you agree with that or not is irrelevant. That's what it needs. It needs a do-over. And until that happens, Square Enix is going to continue having the same problem. Another thing that's wrong with Square Enix is that they've been unsuccessful getting off of Final Fantasy. They've been unsuccessful in making new IP. Only a small audience cares about games like Octopath Traveler. No one gave a fuck about Forspoken. No one cared. Star Ocean, I don't even know why they bother with that franchise. Because, once again, no one cares. These new IP, Valkyrie Elysium, no one cared. Babylon's Fall. I mean, could you think of a greater flop than that? Square Enix has an issue with making new IP that actually appeals to people. And that goes double for even when they have control of an IP that people actually care about. They still fail at getting people to care because of asinine decisions that they continue to make game after game after game. A few questions have been answered with recent news. For those who have been skeptical, Square Enix hasn't released any sales figures, so how do you know how well Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has done? Well, we know because of various data from industry analysts. We know because Square Enix hasn't released the sales figures for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth or Final Fantasy XVI since its initial launch month. And now they've confirmed it. They've announced it. These games have fell short of expectations. Their stock has plummeted. They're canceling a bunch of games out of fear of losing more money. I'm sure their shareholders aren't happy either. These are facts that can't be ignored. Their new so-called multi-platform strategy, it'll help them somewhat, but it's not going to make Final Fantasy a 10 million unit selling franchise like Horizon or God of War or Spider-Man. It's just not. People don't give a fuck about the franchise anymore because of the way it's been mishandled for years and continues to be mishandled. So, if and until Square Enix does a hard reboot and hits that reset button and actually gets some people in with some new ideas who understand what the franchise needs to do going forward, the problem is not going to be fixed. That's just the bottom line.